Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to look at the Latin American colonies, the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the New World. General overview. The Spanish Empire was a vast empire strung out all along sort of the western coastline of North and South America from the modern northern part of California all the way down to the southern tip of South America to the Tierra del Fuego, and included many islands in the Caribbean where the core of Spanish imperial rule really resided, let's say at Havana in Cuba. Much of the Spanish Empire rested on an economy of exploitation, that of gold and silver mining. And it was only until the gold reserves of central Mexico and the silver mines of Potosi in South America were exhausted, the Spanish Empire imperial economy had to shift to ranching in some areas as well as cultivation of sugar in others. One should say, of course, that there were many stretches of the Spanish Empire that were severely underpopulated. One thinks of the northern part of Mexico and what is the modern southwestern portion of the United States. Even into the 18th century and the 19th century, these areas tended to be considerably underpopulated, consisting only of sporadic mission posts here and there that preserved the integrity of the Spanish frontier. The Portuguese Empire was somewhat more centrally located in Brazil and largely dependent on the cultivation of sugar, as we've suggested in earlier lectures. Both of these countries adopted forms of imperial rule that took European institutions, European ways of governing their home countries, and applied them to the New World to a greater or lesser extent. We'll see a little bit of compare and contrast the way the Spanish apply this and the way the Portuguese apply this. In terms of government, the Spanish Empire institutes what's called the Council of the Indies in 1524. So really just a few years after exploration was begun in the 1490s. The Spanish put in a system, an apparatus to govern its new territories. And the Council of the Indies was sort of really that sort of central governing body. And many of the declarations, many of the instructions had to come from the Council of the Indies in order to give the Spanish administration in the New World the right to pursue certain prerogatives. The Spanish government also set up what were called viceroyalties. A viceroy is a sort of as the name kind of implies there, a vice king or a viceroyal. Sort of an appointment of the Spanish monarch to act as the king, as the king's primary emissary in that region. So these were the top colonial governors. And there were two large viceroyalties that were first established, that of New Spain in the northern part of Spain's empire, and Peru, which was largely the old Inca Empire. In time, and in the reforms of the mid-18th century, the Spanish will expand these to include a few more viceroyalties to make government a little bit more flexible. Portuguese tended to grant a greater degree of flexibility, a little bit more freedom for the local leaders that they had appointed to govern Brazil. Nevertheless, on and off, the principle of mercantilism, which we'll look at later on, a kind of absolutist form of economy, will be that which both the Madrid and Lisbon governments will implement to tightly control the society, economy, and religious exploits of their empires in the New World. And sometimes these principles tended to inhibit not only imperial economic growth, but also in some cases population growth as well, the number of settlers traveling to the world. This will also be somewhat true of France's colonies in North America. Here we have a look at the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the New World. We're going to discount this somewhat later map. We don't actually see New France at all, but that's not the purpose of this map. It's really to look at New Spain and Brazil. And we'll actually see this is after those reforms of the mid-18th century. And so there are actually four Spanish viceroyalties here. In addition to New Spain and Peru, we also see Rio de la Plata and New Granada. New Granada is kind of modern-day Colombia, Ecuador, northern parts of Peru, Venezuela, as well as parts of Latin America as well, and Rio de la Plata, Argentina, Bolivia, so those central South American countries. We also see here a great quote from Cardinal Granville, who was a Spanish administrator, commenting on the slow process by which directives came from Spain, from the Council of the Indies, and he once quipped that if death came from Spain, I should be immortal. One way in which both of these empires sought to direct the development of colonial society was through missionary activity. The church was seen as the handmaiden of these empires in converting the natives and also spreading European culture. It was a way of enculturating the natives, essentially making them Spaniards, making them Portuguese. And therefore, the prevailing theory went, therefore, more pliable, more easily governed. If they were, in fact, Christians, then they would model the obedience that every Christian was called upon to their secular rulers. This will continue apace as the Counter-Reformation, which we've looked at in an earlier lecture, takes hold, especially in Spain. So Counter-Reformation principles of conversion, of consistent teachings, of doctrinal and practical uniformity throughout the church, both in Europe and in the New World, will take effect. New orders, Jesuits, old orders like the Dominicans will become increasingly popular in the New World as they seek to convert. Initially, the missionaries tried to convert elites. As that falters, as it often does, they went for large-scale baptisms, but one questions the depth of conversion and religious understanding that was the result of these sort of mass conversions. In the same way that we saw a similar process at stake in let's say, late antique and early modern Europe, or early medieval Europe. By the 1530s, some missionaries, becoming somewhat frustrated in their conversion efforts, resort to much more coercive means to convert. And this actually ended up the torture, execution, destruction of native texts and culture and lifestyle was actually rather alarming to some in the New World. The Spanish and Portuguese settlers tended to be very harsh very quickly towards the natives. And so there were many priests in the church that saw themselves then as advocates and protectors of the native population against the treatment of their fellow Spaniards and Portuguese. One most notable was the Spaniard Bartolomé de las Casas, and he became very, very influential in promoting the new law of 1542. And this really outlawed the enslavement of natives. So for a very brief period of time, as we saw in an earlier lecture, Europeans tried to enslave the native populations to work on early plantations. By the 1540s, however, this was already seen as not being effective. The importation of African slaves was growing apace. And so that, coinciding with de las Casas' agitation, created this new law. The process of conversion also created something rather strange in Latin Christianity, and that was a somewhat more syncretic accumulation. Now, remember, syncretism is when you take, when sort of two cultures or two faiths or something like that collide, and you get a kind of a blending of the two. So, for instance, in many central Mexican religious ceremonies, for the old Aztec religion, the blood cult and human sacrifice was very popular. And so you had these sort of very gory depictions of what religious life was like in these early societies, um, and or in these the native imperial societies. So what happens is that combines with Christianity to create a kind of overemphasis on crucifixion imagery, in which Christ is the bloody, tortured, mutilated, pouring with blood from all these wounds on his back and so forth. And so a really very grim vision of the crucifixion is something that will become quite popular in Latin Christianity. We'll also see some things, for instance, when the Last Supper is shown in art, there will actually be, instead of bread and wine as you would see in a European depiction, there would actually be sort of native foods and so forth and so on. It's a very interesting take on it. As time goes on, the church becomes the wealthiest and most powerful institution in the Spanish New World. As it was a very wealthy and powerful institution in Europe. Now let's look at the colonial economy. In the Spanish economy of exploitation in the New World, we see the gold mines of central Mexico and the silver mines of Peru. These two areas made mining, made Spain incredibly wealthy. And was able to buy them much power and prestige back in Europe. Part of that, however, resulted in this sort of importation of gold and silver, all of this new currency, created a situation whereby there was rampant inflation in Europe as well. And we'll look at how the European economy has to adjust itself to all this new gold and silver flooding the European economy. Precious metals were mined, as I said, transforming that economy. Other elements of the colonial economy, the encomienda. This was initially a guarantee of native labor to Spanish settlers. The encomienda was essentially overturned by the new law of 1542, in which, well, at the very least, natives could not be enslaved by those settlers. But it was used at a time when labor supply was very thin on the ground, before there was any significant Spanish settlement of the New World, and so it was a kind of an unpleasant stopgap. In Brazil, as we've seen already, sugar plantations were the principal source of economic growth in the Portuguese Empire, and the importation of African slaves became increasingly more important, and the slave trade grew as the native population both declined and as laws were passed prohibiting the use of Native Americans as slaves or as agricultural workers. And in all, we will see a series of tight imperial regulations of the economy. These will consist of things ranging from only selling to Spanish merchants or Portuguese merchants that arrive off the coast, only using Spanish or Portuguese ships to transport, and so on and so forth. Transport goods back to Europe. Trading with other empires, trading between Spain and Portugal was was restricted, but especially with other imperial competitors like the French or the Dutch, especially. The Dutch and the Portuguese were major rivals. The Dutch and the Spanish were major rivals. The English would come to be a major rival of the Spanish. And so trading with those empires would become strictly prohibited. And again, that flies in the face of the principle of free trade and economic growth. And so one could argue that these tight imperial regulations of the economy severely limited the growth of those economies. Finally, we'll look at colonial society. Several social classes will emerge, particularly in the Spanish Empire in the New World. four kind of social classes in New Spain will emerge. First are the peninsulares. These are the people who were from the peninsula. They were from Iberia. They were folks who were born in Spain, who were sent by the imperial administration to govern the New World. These were sort of the top drawer folks. These were the Spain Spaniards, so to speak. They had children in the New World. These children were essentially European, but they were simply born in the New World. These were called Creoles. So they will identify with Hispanic ancestry, but they will also see themselves as being natives of the Americas. And so they're kind of the second class of citizen. These are going to comprise a number of elites. Their ancestors were powerful, influential people, and they will continue to wield a degree of influence in the governance of the New World. Then there are two categories of individuals: people with mixed ancestry, children of European and Native American parents. These are called mestizos, and they occupy certainly a lower rank in those societies. The mixing of different ethnicities was typically frowned upon by Europeans, and then especially those particularly frowned upon were relationships between Europeans and Africans largely because the Africans were slaves, and so mulattoes were sort of the lowest social class. Now, that's true in some places. We'll see actually in the French Empire, there will be a very small class of mulattoes who will become themselves plantation owners and who will own other African slaves. That's a little different situation, and it doesn't happen very often. One of the big differences, let's say, between colonial society, let's say in the Spanish New World or even in the French New World, and what we'll see in the British colonies in particular, is that the Spanish develop a hereditary nobility in the New World. So the nobles, the aristocracy that was so common in Spain, is also going to transplant itself to the New World. We don't see that particularly in the North American colonies. That is going to really restrict the freedom, the movement of people who are lower down on the social ladder, creating kind of that very rigid society which we see in Europe, which for many European societies was the reason why a lot of people left the old world and came to the New World, so as to establish their own sphere of independent freedom and action in the colonies. Be another factor that will somewhat handicap the Spanish colonial system. And of course, we cannot leave this without saying that this period is one in which slavery as an institution blossoms and bears terrible fruit on a scale that has never been seen in really practically in any aspect of human history, but certainly not seen in the history of Western societies. We know full well that the Greeks and the Romans owned slaves, that Islamic traders sold slaves, managed the slave trade across North Africa. But the scale, the tens of millions of people that were enslaved from Africa, transported forcibly to the New World, was something that really was a bit new under the sun. And we will explore that issue at a later date. For now, however, thank you very much for listening.